Thank you. I've not managed to kill it yet, so I'm doing well. I see we're live. I was speaking about my plant, so there we go.
We are live.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very special UJ Philosophy Colloquium. This is co-hosted with the Faculty of Humanities at UJ. It's part of the 4IR Distinguished Series. Speaker today is Professor Johan Rousseau. He studied at the University of Pretoria, UNISA, Leon, I can't pronounce that, Leon 3, and Monash University in Melbourne, where he wrote his doctoral thesis on the theological motifs in Bernard Stiegler's Technics. He is the author of about 20 academic articles and book chapters, 2 novels, and of more than 400 newspaper articles and columns that have appeared locally and internationally. Prof. Rousseau's areas of speciality are tradition and modernity, the philosophy of technology, and philosophical theology. He joined the University of Free State Philosophy Department as lecturer in 2012. Currently, he is professor and HOD of the department. The title of his talk is The Fourth Industrial Revolution, a Case of South African Techno-Messianism. I'm doing air quotes with my fingers because he has Fourth Industrial Revolution in scare quotes, and he's going to explain why in this talk. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Rousseau.
Thank you very much, Ashil. Thank you for that introduction and for this invitation. It's been ages since I've had the opportunity to interact with colleagues outside my own department, and I'm really delighted that we can have this engagement. So, Ashil, what I propose to do, it's a written text that has been published, but it's very much work in progress. I'm by no means settled on the ideas here, and I must also say, as maybe a disclaimer, I wrote this text partly in anger at stuff happening inside my own university, so I may at times sound angrier about the concept than what I probably am. So I'm going to read this text. I think it will take about 45 to 50 minutes, and I'm going to try and do my best not to repeat my typical error of trying to read too fast, because I know it makes it more difficult for the listeners, especially since I don't really use slides. So here we go. The South African public sphere does not often focus on technological concepts. It was thus initially quite surprising for me to hear talk of the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution start practically overnight, perhaps from early 2018, just after, and this I think is important, just after the annual South African delegation to the World Economic Forum at Davos, Switzerland, led by President Cyril Ramaphosa, returned to the country. What was even more surprising was the lightning speed with which the concept was adopted, not only by Ramaphosa and other members of the government, but also by some public university leaders. After the wilderness years under the traditionalist former South African President Jacob Zuma, it was initially a breath of fresh air to hear talk of such a seemingly futuristic concept, instead of the ongoing fight for a better past of which South African politicians apparently never tired. And yet precisely the speed with which the concept of the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution was adopted should have raised some suspicion, since post-apartheid South Africa has by now quite a record of obfuscating deep structural problems and poor policies with conceptual buzzwords. Affirmative action and Black economic empowerment enriched a happy few simply for who they were rather than for what they did, and all this at the expense of the unhappy many lacking the necessary networks and connections to be empowered. Transformation atrophied into a barely disguised policy of racial replacement. Decolonization for a while channeled the anger of the disaffected youth, but made not an iota of difference to the self-imposed colonial pursuit of places in the Anglo-American world rankings of universities, and so on and so forth. There is thus reason to suspect that the concept of the fourth industrial revolution has to be treated with circumspection. As I will argue below, the circumspection is not only warranted by the post-apartheid tendency at conceptual shallowness, but also by the dubious nature of the concept itself, as well as its origins and the circles in which it is propagated. In order to argue the case for the circumspection, a thorough understanding of industrialization and the Industrial Revolution is first required, for which the work of the contemporary French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, born 1952, passed away 2020, is essential. So first I'm going to take you on a brief tour through the thought of Stiegler regarding techniques and the human. Stiegler begins his work with the publication of his trilogy, translated into English under the title Techniques and Time. Regis Debray, who introduced me in 2002 to the work of Stiegler, described him to me as a Heideggerian technophile, an apt description in the light of the Stiegler of Techniques and Time, setting out to argue against the Heidegger of being and time, and later in the essay on the question concerning technology, that unlike Heidegger thinks, techniques does not threaten to close off our life world, but instead, in principle, co-constitutes our life world. And this because techniques are, in Stiegler's view, not only a form of memory, but also equates to Heidegger's notion of the life that I have not lived myself, the famous facticity. Stiegler argues for techniques as a form of memory, drawing on the work of the French paleoanthropologist André Leroi-Gourhan, for whom early human consciousness and tool-making co-constitute each other. The first stone knife began its existence as an idea in the consciousness of a human, and in the act of making that stone knife, the consciousness of the tool maker was externalized in the act of making the tool. In regards to Neanderthalian tool making, Stiegler writes that cortex and equipment, brain cortex and equipment are differentiated together in one and the same movement. It is a singular process of structural coupling in exteriorization that we are calling an instrumental maiutics, a mirror protostage in the course of which the differentiation of the cortex is determined by the tool just as much as that of the tool by the cortex. So human and technical evolution co-constitute each other, argues Stiegler. Moreover, every time that another stone knife is made, it is a repetition of that first act of the making of a stone knife and its concomitant externalization of consciousness, and as such, the second stone knife is an act of remembering of the first one. The first stone knife and all subsequent stone knives are thus acts of memorialization of the first act of the making of a stone knife. This is how Stiegler describes it, referring to the first tool as the stereotype and subsequent reproductions of the first tool or stereotype as the material trace, and to early human consciousness as the archaic cortex. Quote from him is, "The memory of the stereotype is kept in the material trace of the stereotype, in which the pre-existing tool itself consists, repeated, duplicated by its maker and guiding the latter much more than being guided by him or her. In this sense, the archaic cortex or the brain and equipment are co-determined." So it's just a restatement of human and technical evolution taking place together. A further important phase in techniques as memory is entered with the invention of memory or recording technologies in the form of writing, beginning with cuneiform in ancient Mesopotamia and hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt. This is important in the evolution of techniques as memory, since it is a clearer manifestation of techniques as memory, but also since it begins to alter the ways in which we remember and think. These changes are demonstrated clearly with what Stiegler sees as a key event in the history of memory technology, or mnemotechnics, from the Greek word mnemo. And that key event is the Greek adoption of the Phoenician alphabet, about 800 BC. The Greek adoption of the alphabet is a watershed for Stigler in human history, for when the Greeks adopt the alphabet, a number of consequences that would shape human history take place. These include a stabilization and standardization of the shared stock of knowledge of the community. Stigler calls this the pre-individual fund, which in my view equates to tradition. So that is altered, standardized. Then the codification of the law by Solon in Athens, greater access for the community to its shared stock of knowledge, and a greater potential for critical reflection upon this shared stock of knowledge, citizenship, etc. And he sees this critical reflection as the precondition of ancient Greek philosophy. Stigler denotes this watershed moment in the history of humanity and of memory technology with the notion of orthographics, that is, a memory technology distinguished by its ability to provide a much more faithful recording and rendering of the past than what was possible in oral recording or oral memorization. In Stigler's view, the Greek adoption of the alphabet introduces a period in human history that he refers to as, I've already said, the orthographic epoch, of which the apex is the printed word mid-15th century following on Gutenberg, and which comes to an end with the Industrial Revolution. So why is this so? Let's take a look at what he has to say on industrialization. In Stigler's view, the Industrial Revolution is not so much distinguished by the mechanization of production through technologies such as the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, the use of fossil fuels as a source of energy and electricity, but rather through the development of a number of new memory technologies that he sees as so significant that he thinks that what is actually industrialized in the Industrial Revolution is human memory and consciousness itself. These new memory technologies include the photograph, the phonogram, film, radio, television, the computer, the internet, and digital recording technologies such as the CD, the MP3, and so forth. All these recording technologies are means to externalize, record, and disseminate contents of human consciousness, as we can see with the example of film. A film begins as an idea in the mind of a filmmaker who then writes a script, films it, edits it, and finally distributes it through a studio and bioscopes, these days also streaming, of course. That in turn leads to a process whereby the film audience adopts, through watching the film, that which began as the content of consciousness of the filmmaker. They adopt that. And when this happens, it may even lead to the altering of the consciousness, behavior, and desires of the audience member. In Stigler's view, through the efficient use of film, television, radio, and the music recording industry, the United States of America succeeded during the 20th century to project the American way of life on a global scale, thus creating a global market for American products, an individual consumer lifestyle, and the global sphere of American influence. It's also important to note that for Stigler, industrialization as the externalization and dissemination of the contents of human consciousness is an ongoing process, which is why it makes no sense, in my view, to talk of a first, second, third, or fourth industrial revolution. It should also be noted here that technological change has already, since at least the earlier influential French philosopher of technology, Jacques Ellul, been seen as a self-augmenting or auto-catalytic process. And more it would seem that it is also a process of which the execution speeds up the process. That is, technological change happens faster and faster, and the speed at which things happen and are done keep on increasing until where we have probably already crossed a critical threshold beyond which intelligent human reflection on what is happening can no longer take place as it used to. things simply happen too fast for us to process. An older contemporary of Stigler, the French philosopher Paul Virilio, 1932 to 2018, made this the central theme of his work from his breakthrough book, Speed and Politics, published already in 1977, in which Virilio already warned of the moment when critical decisions that might determine the future of humanity would have to be taken at a speed faster than what humans can handle. Stigler has his own significant take on this phenomenon with his concept of the performativity beyond human consciousness. What he refers to with this concept is the phenomenon where decisions that shape reality and our experience of reality are taken, as it were, quasi-automatically and beyond conscious human reflection. For example, when an event is identified as newsworthy and then spreads around the world through media networks and their audiences without the time to reflect properly on the event. In this regard, the telling anecdote is told in the documentary film, which I'm sure many of you have seen, 2019's The Great Hack. And the anecdote is told by Brittany Kaiser, a former employee of Cambridge Analytica, when she relates how on the day the Guardian newspaper broke the scandal involving Cambridge Analytica's misuse of private data of Facebook users, the story was carried worldwide by more than 30,000 media outlets, rendering Cambridge Analytica completely unable to cope with all the media inquiries. Stigler refers to the changes in human consciousness, human memory, the nature of the event, how we see history, our experience of time and space, and so forth, that are brought about by the rise of these new memory technologies as the orthostatic epoch, in distinction to the orthographic. Since these technologies of the orthostatic epoch have an even greater ability than various forms of writing technologies to give a precise rendering of what is recorded. That's the key distinction. It's a more precise rendering. Yet he also warns of how this greater precision also skews our experience of reality, since no memory technology is able to record everything there is to record, and since we still need our consciousness and some norms of processing what we experience to make sense of what is recorded and also of what we experience. A further important point is that as new industrial technologies appear, up to and including the latest forms of recording technologies, such as nano and digital technologies, these technologies share two characteristics. First, later technologies develop, as it were, in technological lineages from earlier technologies, and here Stigler draws on the work of Bertrand Gilles, with the implication that later technologies often build on, incorporate, and rely on earlier technologies in the line. One can, for example, not use digital technologies without electricity. Second, the development of ever more advanced memory technologies also goes hand in hand with ever more advanced symbolic representations of reality, relying on ever more developed forms of literacy and numeracy. And with this, Stigler refers to this with the concept of grammatization that he sources from Sylvain Auroux. Each new recording technology involves its own forms of grammatization, but just like later technologies built on earlier ones, in order to master newer forms of grammatization, one requires earlier forms of grammatization. For example, without first learning to read, write, and do sums, you will not be able to learn coding, the periodic table, or the mapping of the human genome. From all of the above, a number of implications follow. First, in order to participate in ongoing industrialization, a country has to first master and crucially also maintain earlier technologies, memory technologies, and various forms of grammatization. Second, if a country is not able to keep abreast with ongoing industrialization, it will not be able to enter a later phase of industrialization successfully. Three, since the industrial countries of the world tend to shape the world, those countries who do not industrialize are shaped by the industrial countries. Number 4, the history of Western colonization is inconceivable without the role of industrialization. Those who industrialized were able to subjugate those who were not industrialized. And so, former colonies, such as South Africa, who want to overcome their colonial nature, cannot do this without establishing and maintaining the necessary industrial technologies and their concomitant forms of grammatization. Number 5, if such countries do not succeed in this, and then try to enter the industrial economy as it were during its most developed latest phase, they are unleashing such powerful forces on themselves that they can only end in new forms of colonial subjugation to those who truly understand and control ongoing industrialization. Perhaps this relates to what we saw last week in this country. This brings me in section 3 now to this notion of a fourth industrial revolution, question mark. We can now weigh up this concept to see whether it is of any use to understand the history and the continuing unfolding of industrialization. The concept of the fourth industrial revolution was invented by Klaus Schwab, born 1938, and introduced in his book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, 2016. Schwab's background is in engineering, economics and management, and is of course the founding director of the World Economic Forum, the WEF, and a member of the opaque Bilderberg Group. The Bilderberg Group has over the years faced accusations of being a very influential group that is neither transparent nor democratically accountable. The WEF, in turn, has often been criticized for espousing a type of capitalism that threatens democracy and deepens global inequality. Mention is made of this because, as will become clear soon, this is of great relevance to make sense of the influence that the fourth industrial revolution has so astonishingly quickly gained in South Africa. Since, as I shall argue in a moment, the influence of the concept can certainly not be ascribed to its heuristic value in aiding humanity to make sense of the challenges that ongoing industrialization are posing. So let us turn to Schwab's definition of the fourth industrial revolution. Schwab claims that so far there have been 3 industrial revolutions and that the fourth one is currently unfolding. In his view, the first industrial revolution ran from about 1760 to 1840, was triggered by the construction of railroads and the invention of the steam engine, and ushered in mechanical production, he says. The second industrial revolution, he writes, started in the late 19th century and ran into the early 20th century, and he says it made mass production possible, fostered by the advent of electricity and the production line. Skipping what seems to be about 5 decades and making no mention in passing of the industrialization of murder in the 2 world wars, including the industrialized genocide of Jews, Gypsies, and homosexuals perpetrated by the Nazis, Schwab then claims the third industrial revolution began in the 1960s and is usually called the computer or digital revolution because it was catalyzed by the development of semiconductors, mainframe computing, personal computing, and the internet. This brings him then to the so-called fourth industrial revolution that he writes began at the turn of the century and builds on the digital revolution. He continues, it is characterized by a much more ubiquitous and mobile internet, by smaller and more powerful sensors that have become cheaper, and by artificial intelligence and machine learning. He admits that digital technologies that have computer hardware, software networks at their core are not new, but in a break with the third industrial revolution, they are becoming more sophisticated and integrated and are, as a result, transforming societies and the global economy, end quote. This revolution, however, he continues, is not only about smart and connected machines and systems, since occurring simultaneously are waves of further breakthroughs in areas ranging from gene sequencing to nanotechnology, from renewables to quantum computing. What then, in his view, truly distinguishes the fourth industrial revolution is the fusion of these technologies and their interaction across the physical, digital, and biological domains. To be fair and of relevance to the South African context, Schwab does stress that the second industrial revolution, as he calls it, must still be experienced by the roughly 17% of humanity, roughly 1.3 billion people, who still lack electricity, while the third industrial revolution still awaits the more than half of humanity, roughly 4 billion people, who still do not have internet access. Thus, with reference to Stigler's analysis of industrialization, and in line with what I've argued concerning the implications of Stigler's analysis, Schwab does signal an awareness that one or the other phase of industrialization cannot be entered into without having first mastered the earlier phases. But this is about as much, I think, as one can say in favor of Schwab's understanding of industrialization. Let us now critically assess his concept of industrialization. For a start, Schwab gives no indication that he understands that industrialization is first and foremost the industrialization of human consciousness and memory. This is why, somewhat ironically for the professed capitalist that he is, he fails to spell out the implications of the first and second industrial revolutions, except, and this is where the irony comes in, for referring in good old Marxist fashion to production. Of course, first the mechanization of production and then mass production. About the massive socio-political effects of industrialization from 1760 to 1960, he has nothing much to say. These effects include Western imperialism and colonialism in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, the rise of the nation-state first in industrialized countries, the growth in global economic inequality, I should say, between the West and the rest, and, as has already been pointed out, industrialized warfare and killing in the 20th century, symbolized and prefigured by the use of the Gatling gun in colonial wars between the European industrial powers and anti-colonial forces in the just mentioned parts of the world. Second, Schwab clearly has next to no grasp of industrialization as the industrialization of human consciousness and memory. He makes no mention of the memory technologies from the photograph and the phonogram onwards, except for mentioning the computing technologies of the so-called Third Industrial Revolution, and makes absolutely no mention of the impact that these technologies have had on democracy. You all probably took note of the so-called Pegasus spyware scandal breaking at the moment. He also makes no mention of the impact that these technologies have had on the state, culture, our experience of space, time, the event, the nature of history, or on education. It's undoubtedly due to the fact that Schwab sees and thinks about technology in narrow economic terms, which leads him, at least later in his book, to mention the threat that the current crop of industrial technologies, such as artificial intelligence, including algorithms, could pose to worldwide socio-political stability. In fact, if Schwab did have a proper grasp of the nature of industrialization as the industrialization of human consciousness and memory, he would be able to see that all the technologies that he mentions as part of the fourth industrial revolution, such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, gene sequencing, nanotechnology, and quantum computing, are but further stages in the externalization of human consciousness and memory. Moreover, if Schwab did have this insight into the nature of ongoing industrialization, he would have had no need to proclaim a discontinuous understanding of industrialization as four different revolutions, which in my view simply mystifies the very real challenges that humanity is in fact facing as a result of industrial technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, and algorithms, as is only too well illustrated by the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and I should add the Pegasus spyware scandal as well. The most one can say in favor of Schwab's fourth industrial revolution is that it is at least an attempt to invite people to think about technology, economy, and society albeit in my view, not a very successful attempt. Why then has this weak concept gained so much traction so quickly in South Africa? And what risks does the quick adoption by parts of the country's governing and university leadership entail? This brings me then to my remarks on South Africa as an enduring colony. In order to answer the first question, South Africa's enduring colonial nature first has to be evoked. I've elsewhere discussed 9 characteristics of South Africa that have remained unchanged since the late 19th century to the present, and which testify to the fact that this country is for practical purposes still a colonial society. For the purposes of this paper, at least 3 of these characteristics are relevant. First, South Africa's model of excellence is always sought outside the country. This explains why the weak concept of the Fourth Industrial Revolution gained not only overnight traction in South Africa, but is now practically state dogma. Above mention was made of the fact that Schwab's WEF is associated with a type of capitalism that threatens democracy and the ecology. This, however, has never stopped the ANC government from sending an annual delegation to this dubious gathering. This annual delegation took on much greater significance since the current president of the ANC in South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, started to lead this delegation. As of 2018, that is shortly after Ramaphosa's election as president of the ANC and then of the country, the Fourth Industrial Revolution was suddenly on everybody's lips. The only conceivable explanation for this hasty adoption of this weak concept is that it must be understood as part of a desperate attempt by a modernizing president to convince the WEF circle and its powerful investors that he is in touch with the latest cutting-edge thought and policy making. And then the poor man forgets his iPad in the car. I state this as the only conceivable explanation, not just because the Fourth Industrial Revolution is such a weak concept, but also because in the light of 2 other enduring colonial characteristics of South Africa, and in the light of 2 disastrous results of the ANC government, it simply makes no sense to suddenly want to adopt the latest industrial technologies, which is presumably the intent of hoisting the government's flag on the pole of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The 2 enduring colonial characteristics in question are first, the persistent neglect of South Africa's indigenous languages, and second, the extractive nature of the South African economy that enriches a small intermediary elite acting as agents for foreign capital and making the country dependent on foreign capital inflows, that is, systematically handicapping the country's sovereignty. The persistent neglect of South Africa's indigenous languages in post-apartheid South Africa has meant that the great majority of school children who matriculate do so with a poor command of the English language, which is besides Afrikaans the only widely spoken South African language that can actually supply one with the necessary forms of grammatization to successfully adopt and adapt ongoing industrialization in and to South African conditions. The ANC government's failure to build a successful education system has led to a weakening of the various forms of grammatization that did exist in the country at the advent of democracy in 1994, which has in turn weakened the country's ability to keep abreast with new forms of grammatization and hence with new forms of ongoing industrialization. This is particularly salient in the ANC's fixation on academic universities at the expense of the old system of technikons and vocational colleges. While failing to invest sufficiently in academic universities, and while neglecting the technikons and vocational colleges, except for renaming the technikons as technical universities, the ANC government has, through its policy of massification, flooded the academic universities with academically ill-equipped matriculants, of whom the vast majority fail at university. Moreover, genuinely innovative and quality technical parastatals such as the National Electricity Company, Eskom, South African Airways, South African Broadcasting Corporation, and the vast majority of the nearly 700 state-owned enterprises were essentially plundered through corrupt practices turned into job agencies for ANC cadres and generally neglected. In a word, this can be called the ANC government's humiliation of techniques, which always goes hand in hand with the humiliation of the human. As a result of this, the country now has the highest Gini coefficient in the world, as well as the highest annual per capita protest rate in the world, protests in which technical infrastructure vital to the lives of poor and middle-class South African buildings are often destroyed to get the attention of a negligent government. In other words, after 25 years of the neglect of public education and the humiliation of techniques, now suddenly proclaim that South Africa must join the latest phase of ongoing industrialization is completely disingenuous. In a country where road maintenance, water, and electricity supply are all deteriorating at an alarming rate, that is, where the previous phases of successful South African industrialization have been neglected, it is purely wishful thinking to claim that South Africa must now join the fourth industrial revolution. A particularly salient example of this disingenuity was President Ramaphosa's invocation in his 2019 State of the Nation address of the building of a new smart city. While most existing South African cities are struggling with crumbling infrastructure, water and electricity supply, crippling debt, overpopulation, and violent crime. It is more apt to describe the president's invocation of a smart city as a quasi-mystical incantation, a sort of symbolic sensing of a mostly semi-literate, ill-informed population in the English language that they can only adopt poorly because of their poor education. Stated differently, the president's incantations of the fourth industrial revolution and the smart city are nothing but a sort of sectarian messianism, where in a quasi-mystical and completely irrational fashion a term is religiously incantated, as if it would magically make all the troubles of this broken world disappear. Which brings me in closing to techno-messianism. This techno-messianism, both in the sense of a quasi-mystical incantation of a term and in the sense of treating technology as the great savior, in all likelihood relates to the enduring South African colonial characteristics of an extractive and barely sovereign economy. It would seem that the presidential hope here is that these incantations by himself and by that faction of the governing and university leadership who in a cult-like fashion play act at being modern, would magically and mystically convince the WF Circle to begin investing in South Africa again. In the real world, however, the real risk that such techno-messianism carries for South Africa as an enduring colonial society, and with even less forms of grammatization and less functioning industrial assets from earlier phases of industrialization, the real risk is that by trying to now hastily adopt the latest forms of industrial technology, would simply reassert, probably deepen the colonial nature of this country. If this country was to now, for example, adopt automatization, algorithms, and machine learning in the same poorly considered way as the poorly considered flirtation with the fourth industrial revolution, what would become of the jobs of low-skilled workers? Or what new levels of manipulation would semi-literate South African consumers be subjected to? Surely the recent government-sanctioned scrapping of the debt of poor South African consumers, debt which is undoubtedly a function of the combination of their semi-literacy and manipulative marketing techniques, cannot be repeated ad infinitum by an increasingly cash-strapped government. In closing, in spite of the ill-conceived policies as well as the systemic mismanagement and abuse of education and techniques by the ANC government, some hope may be gained from the remarkable inventiveness of, amongst others, South African commercial agriculture and the private manufacturing industry, both of which have adapted exceptionally well to the highly competitive global environment, and in spite of a government that for the most part treated these sectors of the economy with neglect and often open hostility. These sectors of the economy and here and there pockets of technological excellence that remain in the country's neglected and battered public university system have in fact managed to remain abreast of new forms of grammatization and ongoing industrialization. They are positioned to participate in ongoing industrialization, and they should receive all the support that they can. Hopefully, they can form part of a new socio-political alliance with the professional and underclasses in South Africa that can bring about the genuine social, economic, and political change that this highly creative society is capable of and so desperately needs. This, however, will require a sober and thoughtful engagement with grammatization and ongoing industrialization, and a swift recovery from the techno-messianism of the current president and his modern play-acting followers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rousseau. That didn't sound angry to me.
I'm glad.
Yeah. So what we first do is we allow the students in the audience to ask questions. There are already a few comments in the comment box. I'll read them out because this is being recorded and the recording might not show the comments. Students, please raise your hand if you want to ask a question. I will look for your hand and you can use your microphone and video. Don't all jump in at once. While we wait, Prof. Rousseau, I think we have a hand. Let me just go to the hand. I can't see your full name because my screen is small. It's Mansha. Please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. No, I'd like to thank the Prof for the great presentation. I think my question really centers around the issue of whether South Africa should stay out of the adoption of 4IR technologies, especially given the fact that other countries will be adopting those technologies. And as Prof said, it is the countries that have industrialized that will lead the discussion of the future. So, and I heard his caution in terms of how South Africa should then approach the 4IR. They should not just go all deep in, and I agree with him. I'm just trying to hear from him, what should South Africa do when other countries are adopting 4IR technologies? And I understand he doesn't want to use the word 4IR technologies, so let's say advanced technologies. What should South Africa do in circumstances where other countries are adopting those technologies and they're improving maybe conditions here and there? I just want to hear his view on that, on how we should do it. That's all.
Thank you, Mansha.
Thank you, Mansha. I must make it clear, I was not, it might have sounded like it, but I wasn't advocating a sort of Luddite attack on technology, keeping ourselves outside of all this. There is no such option available to us. For me, the key thing, Mansha, is not if we should adopt these technologies, but how and what are the conditions of preconditions of doing it successfully. So I think in that regard, I would say the first thing is that we should be very clear that the technological developments we talk of today are extremely complex, extremely demanding, and I think that the concept of the 4IR actually mystifies it. I don't think it helps us a lot to understand what we are getting involved with. That's the first point. The second point is that I would say kind of behind my talk is a plea for what I think is a sort of new alliance or series of new alliances that we need in South Africa. And I briefly hinted at it towards the end. I share my friend Moletsi Mbeki's analysis where he argues that in this country, the professional class, the middle class, the underclass, and capital itself is excluded from political power. And I think that if one could find a way for these various factions of society, and there, I mean, things like projects for the transfer of capital and economic self-reliance to the underclass of about 50 to 60% of South Africans is extremely important. Now, in that, I think that whatever we can do to increase literacy and numeracy, and that will certainly entail more mother tongue-based education in such a way, it's called sometimes mother tongue-based bilingual education, is how people like Neville Alexander called it. So kind of, if you like, newer lines where the existing forms of grammatization and capital in South Africa can be aligned and allied with those people who are not yet included. And also, maybe the last thing I should say in this regard, you know, the question that we should also ask is, what are we doing this for? Why do we adopt these technologies? For me, the answer has to be to regain our dignity as South Africans and to increase our self-reliance as a sovereign free country of mutual recognition. I mean, for that matter, I've referred to this Pegasus spyware scandal. We don't want that rubbish in South Africa. It's already present, but we don't want it. We want it out, because it's not the kind of thing that is actually increasing our dignity in this country. In fact, I noted this morning, many of you saw, allegedly the government of Rwanda might have wanted to use that technology against President Ramaphosa. I'm very curious about the Zuma administration's possible use of that, and I'm very curious of the use maybe of that spyware in the recent uprisings that we saw in this country. So that's just an example. And I think that it's also, maybe a last remark, incumbent upon people in the higher education sector and the manufacturing sector, those people who do work with these technologies and who do understand them, to point out what they are, what they can do, what they cannot do, and to try and foster a serious and sober discussion of these things in our public sphere. Thank you.
Thank you for that. While we wait for more student responses, I want to read two comments in the chat box. I'm going to read them both because the first is complimentary and the second one is a bit of a challenge to your view. By the way, Manchu says, thank you, Prof. Well answered. First comment is from Ingrid Baigri. Sorry if I mispronounced that. I agree that the neglect of indigenous languages is a form of cultural genocide for which the current government is accountable. The sooner all universities are obliged to adopt 2 languages, the better. In addition, every indigenous language should be adopted by at least 1 university. Multilingualism has been shown to reduce racial tensions, and the development of a language as an academic language has been shown to enhance cultural pride and the sustainability of the language and culture. We have a rich cultural heritage that needs to be preserved and a nation that needs to be proud of their roots. And I'm going to jump now to Raphael Winkler's comment. Raphael Winkler says, thank you for your interesting talk. I am generally sympathetic with the outlook you present, but I find the links made in your paper between industrialization and colonization somewhat tenuous and arguable, chiefly because colonization precedes the Industrial Revolution by at least 2 centuries. For example, 1492, which marks the onset of European powers westward, that is, into the Americas, or 1600, the year in which we see the East India Company created, that marks the expansion of European powers eastwards. Whereas the Industrial Revolution begins in 1760. The links between technology and colonialism are fairly more complex than what might be taken away from Stiegler. Do you want to respond to that while we wait for more hands?
Yes, thank you. Let me take the comments in the order that I would make. Yeah, Ingrid, I by and large agree with you. I think that it for me is very, very worrying that we had, I think, a golden opportunity after 1994 to think very creatively about bilingual institutions. And it's interesting, I always think of how someone like the great Johan Degenaar in an interview said that his own sense for the other, awareness of the other, he credited first and foremost to having gone to a bilingual school in Ladysmith in the Old Natal, I think in the 1940s and 50s. So I can only concur with what you say there. I think bilingual schools is an incredibly important thing lacking in the South African education landscape. Incidentally, about universities, shall we say, adopting indigenous languages, I mean, there's a lot of interesting work being done at UKZ and UWC, and also the medical school of UCT, etc. There are various laudable examples in the use of translanguaging and tutorials, which we also in our department here at the UFS does with our first years. But the sad fact of the matter is that we need bold university leadership, I think, for this to happen. And the historically Afrikaans universities leadership, when Afrikaans was still a language in those universities, fell over their feet to sacrifice the language. And then I see very, very little signs in higher education South Africa on the level of, let's say, University South Africa for serious discussion. And I guess it's a case of pressure has to be applied from the bottom up for that sort of thing to happen. Rafael, onto your question and remarks, thank you. I think it's very pertinent. I don't think I have a serious disagreement with you, neither I think which Stigler have had. I can perhaps just clarify one or two things. Because the talk focused on the notion of industrialization, I strongly emphasized the links between colonialism and industrialization also in an African context. But of course, there's I think, quite a well-known and in my view, widely accepted argument today that the print revolution in Europe in the late 1400s, early 1500s was absolutely instrumental in the colonial project of Europe. I'm aware of some research that has been done on how, for example, social categories became much more stratified and standardized with print culture. And it's no surprise then that the notion of race, in a modern sense, on my understanding at least, became very pertinent from the early 1600s in the colonization of South and Central America. The other anecdote I just want to refer here, Rafael, probably you are aware of the work of the great Ivan Illich. Now, Illich, I think, is a really underestimated thinker, but Illich wrote a book with a man called Barry Sanders, if I'm not mistaken. I think it is it's called something like ABC. But in there, he discusses a very pertinent fact here, which is that 2 weeks before Christopher Columbus set out to on his fateful journey to the Americas, a Castilian by the name of Antonio Nebrijas or something, his name is a very fancy Spanish name. He drew up the first Castilian grammar, and Castilian then later became the backbone of modern Spanish. And in his dedication of his Castilian grammar book, he dedicated it to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, and said that he hopes that this will strengthen the unity of the Spanish state. So that was, he might have referred to the Kingdom of Castilla or whatever, but that was the gist of it. So it's a point Illich often makes. It was also a great thinker of technology, and Stigler also in some of his work refers to the effect that the adoption of printing had on giving European powers of the 17th century something of a technological head start or advance over many other countries. And a similar thesis, as you probably know, is also developed by Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs and Steel. So I do not want to give a skewed image of colonization as only related to industrialization. I would rather say that it has to do a lot also with, shall we say, skewed patterns of technological adoption and development in various parts of the world. But yeah, by and large, I don't have serious qualms with what you say. I think it's a valuable point you make. Thank you.
Thank you. Ingrid responds to your response, Professor, saying that thank you for your response. Trans-languaging was great and worked well in face-to-face venues, but it is unfortunately very difficult to do in an online context. And Suzelle Tim says, a very interesting presentation, theoretically sound and politically informed. Thank you very much. Do we have more questions or comments from anyone, students, post-students?
Ashil, while we wait, if there are more comments or questions coming, I just want to comment on Ingrid's comment on translanguaging being very difficult in an online environment. I'd just like to make two comments on that. For what it's worth, in our department here at UFS, we also had a similar experience that translanguaging is very difficult because how do you divide people up into 4 or 5 discussants per group and do it online and chat in their own language? I mean, it also involves writing them all sorts of things and bandwidth and what have you. So I fully concur with that. But having said that, I think that's the second thing here is I don't want to take the discussion off topic, but I do think that that what we've experienced in the past 18 months with this being forced online, I mean, we've all seen that there are wonderful advantages. We arguably would not have had this talk if it wasn't for that. But at the same time, I think that we've seen, and I guess the phenomenologists, of which I'm also one, might agree with what I'll say here, which is that for learning, for dialogue, for thinking together, nothing beats the embodied experience and the physical coming together in the same space at the same time. I gave a talk at the Girard conference, the 10th of July, where I speculated that I wonder whether the fact that so much of our lives went online the past 18 months, because so much of online information is deeply manipulated by algorithms, whether that hasn't had a significant impact, not only on fake news, but on deepening social divisions. And I mean, it's for me personally, it is extremely concerning if I look at what happened last week in KZN, that the alleged instigations that we know about actually happened online. And I find it deeply worrying that one of the things that colonialism, of course, does is to destroy indigenous traditions. And our indigenous traditions are in a haggard state, but traditions mediate. They teach us norms. They teach us to distinguish between what is information, what is disinformation. And it's very worrying for me that in parts of our country where people live in abject poverty, often struggling with unemployment, very low levels of literacy, etc., it's precisely there where these so-called social media, I think it's anti-social media, have such a massive impact and can actually throw people into a condition of what René Girard called mimetic contagion. I've got no doubt that's what we saw last week. So all the more reason, Ingrid, I think that we should all think, at least in the university sector, of ways and means of increasing the literacy by using our students' first languages as an asset and activating those assets for better learning, understanding, and knowledge.
Thank you. More questions or comments? Johan, I think one of the things that might have been, one of the things that is quite vital is Stigler's ideas about, what is it, the externalization of memory and consciousness. I know you had to decide what you were going to put into this talk, and you couldn't give much background information given the time limit. But I don't have a background in that, but I found it quite interesting what you were saying. Did I hear you correctly? Did I hear you saying that, according to Stigler, what technology is these, and I'm bringing in stuff that I know here. It's the externalization of fundamental ancient elements of consciousness. It seems to us as if it's a deliberate conscious effort, but what is happening is all this stuff is being put out into the world. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, Ashil, Stigler is not the only person to say that. I'm aware, I'm not very knowledgeable about it, but I'm aware also in the more analytical philosophical world, this is referred to as, I think it's something like the external consciousness thesis, something to that effect. And I once heard a talk about it, and I found quite a few similarities between that and Stigler's analysis. But I think the essence of what Stigler is trying to get at is to say that any form of techniques, even the most basic tools, is co-constituted with human consciousness. So, I mean, I guess many of you would know Heidegger's analysis of the hammer. What happens when I pick up the hammer and how it changes me? I sometimes try to explain it to students tongue-in-cheek to say that a person, let's say of 20 years old, getting behind the steering wheel of an old Volkswagen City Golf is very different than if you would put that person behind the steering wheel of a powerful sports car. Yeah? So the point for Stigler is that, let me say two things, is that all techniques, all technologies to an extent begin in consciousness, but then in a sense that what began in human consciousness is in a sense perennialized, if I can put it like that, in that tool. That first stone knife and its reproduction always repeats that externalization. And then the key thing for him is what he sees as distinctive about the Industrial Revolution is that he says, even if you go from that oldest tool making and cuneiform and, for example, there's very interesting stuff on the role that money and even haystacks played in Babylonia as forms of remembering and counting and so on. Going from that to alphabetization in Greece and, of course, the adoption of other writing systems elsewhere in the world, up until printing culture, the one thing that's different in the Industrial Revolution is it's a revolution in which memory technology itself is the driver. That is what changes everything. And so I think that the thing that worries me, if I can just add something here, is what Stigler calls the new proletariat. So in the industrial society, what we would have is fossil fuels is the main source of energy, but then of course also human physical energy. The proletarian being somebody whose subsistence skills suddenly overnight becomes worthless and meaningless, and then only has his or her physical energy to sell for sustenance in a factory. So in the industrial society, Stigler says that well-known picture from Marx then also entails that the capitalist is someone who wants to control the means of production. But then he says when we enter the post-war economy in the industrialized parts of the world, at the time we heard more and more talk of a so-called post-industrial society, and he thinks that's an absolute lie. It's a myth, because he says what actually happened from the 1960s onwards is that through the further development of memory technologies, a whole so-called leisure industry arose. And that leisure industry focused on people's so-called free time. So we all end up watching sports over the weekend or looking at music videos, or my 14-year-old son who's forever on TikTok. So that sort of things happen. And then hand in hand with that is a new type of proletarian arises, which is more or less all of us in this meeting. And those are the people who actually gain their life by selling their attention. And so he says in the industrial economy, your typical occupational hazard would be a bodily one. And in the hyper-industrial economy, it's a psychological one. It's burnout, it's depression, it's anxiety, all of the things that we all suffered from in the past 18 months. So what is for me extremely worrisome is in some of his later work, such as his book, Automatic Society, he discusses how through the use of algorithms in the mass media and so-called social media, this process of the colonization of our attention is taking leaps and bounds forward. And then it becomes a question, how do we resist this? Now, I'm in that sense, I'm a fan of the old Greeks in that, but it doesn't have to be the old Greeks. The older traditions that teach us the value of contemplation, whether that is also through physical exercise or contemplative practices and that sort of thing. And none of that we teach our students, none of that. It seems to me and it feels to me often that we, even as academics, we're like Leibnizian monads fighting these individual struggles to keep control of our own attention and consciousness. And we're left to our own devices. And I think that goes for many, many people out there. So we really need to think about what are those collective practices whereby we can take back our attention and have our attention cultivated in the service of ideals like the public good or a dignified, self-reliant South Africa, whatever be the case. Anyway, I'm rambling. I see there are more comments there, Ashil.
Thanks for that very entertaining and informative and fascinating ramble. It made me think of meditation apps. On the one hand, I'm grateful that there are such things, but the point is you should get off your phone to do those things, those kinds of activities, off the technology. I'm going to read, there are 2 comments and 1 question. Mansha, thanks you. Indeed, technologies or advanced technologies are better thought of as extensions of humanity. All the systems are designed by humans, thus they carry forward humanity's thoughts and consciousness. Seems like that's agreeing with you. Do you want to comment on that, or should I just go to the next comment?
Please carry on.
Yes, Raphael Winkler, it's also a comment. And he ends it by saying that it's probably better to have a face-to-face chat about it. But let me just read it. Raphael says, thanks for your response. I agree. Yes, the effects of the Gutenberg revolution in Europe were quite unique in the 16th century. It resulted in, among other things, the decline of Latin as the authoritative language and the standardization of colloquial languages. But they started to be felt in the colonies, specifically in South America, from the end of the 17th and early 18th centuries in a very different way. I think I recall one of Benedict Anderson's arguments in his book, Imagined Communities, is that printing was central to the formation of nationalism in the colonies. That is, the unification of a political group distinct and opposed to the interests of the colonizing power, that is, of Spain, Portugal, etc. But anyway, this requires a more appropriate face-to-face kind of conversation than this. Do you want to reply to that? Then I will go to the next couple of questions.
I will just quickly respond to Raphael. Anderson's book is, of course, a key book. It's usually read as a political philosophy book, but it's, I think, just as important a book in the philosophy of technology. And Raphael, I think that the case that Anderson makes in his book on the role of the adoption of printing by colonized countries in their anti-colonial struggles is incredibly important. In fact, we know that in South Africa, I speak under correction, I think the first journal started in South Africa, or sort of newspaper, was Die Zuid-Afrikaan, which was a Dutch/Afrikaans publication in the 1830s. But what is often forgotten is that a very significant movement to develop isiXhosa and isiZulu and newspapers in those languages got underway from the late 19th century. And I think that movement was absolutely instrumental in making more indigenous South Africans aware of the colonial project and to resist it. And we know the role of the missionary institutions, educational institutions in the Eastern Cape in the founding of the ANC, etc., etc. But what is more important for me about that is that is an example of what one could say is successful adoption of a memory technology. Successful because it advances your own interests, and it could hopefully help you to advance those interests in such a way that you can take your place in the world, that you're not against the world, that you're not just anti, but that you also stand for something. And I think Mandela and his formation by print culture is a very, very interesting example that still needs to be analyzed from that perspective. But Ashil, maybe you can go on to Catherine and Chad's comments.
Okay, so Catherine says, thank you for your talk, Johan. I agree that conceiving of techniques as memory, as a means to alter how we remember and think, is a very powerful idea that we get from Stigler. In this context, I agree that it is of significance that Schwab somehow forgets to include the World War I and World War II in his history of industrialization, due to the well-documented massive scientific, medical, and other technological advances during these times. Could you speculate on why you think Schwab's history willfully ignores this?
Yeah, Catherine, I think it's a difficult question, and I think it is indeed something that I, for one, can only speculate on. And why I think it's a difficult question is because, I don't know much about Schwab's biography. I read a bit about him on the internet and so on, but maybe there are answers in his biography. I mean, I speak under correction, but I think he was born in 1936, so he would have lived through the Second World War, and it makes it an even more interesting question: why does he not refer to the wars in his history? That's one remark to make. A second one is that, I think that, as I alluded to in my presentation, Schwab, in my view, tends to think of technology mostly in its economical sense. He does very little, speaks very little about the social effects, the political effects, etc., etc., except where he warns how, for example, automation can create new joblessness and that sort of thing. But it's always kind of, it's as if he thinks very much in, I guess, a new liberal economic model, and anything else that he has to say about technology and its dark side and dark effects is only in relation to how it might be relevant to this model. And that precisely is, of course, the problem. And this is what worries me so much of the quick adoption of this concept in South Africa, because we at our department, for what it's worth, we're working now on bringing in philosophy of technology modules from next year. But we try, for example, from the first year to make our students aware of basic things like the dangers of Instagram, you know, or how their attention is colonized by YouTube videos and whatever. There's an interesting statistic at the UFS. 96% of internet traffic at the UFS is YouTube. So I just think that it is incumbent upon us, especially in the humanities, to alert our students to these things and make them aware that colonization, imperialism, and these industrialized wars, industrial killing, is equally part of the story. And I mean, if we can imagine that by the late 19th century, African countries had at least made some sort of start in industrialization, arguably the history of African colonization would have looked very different. The same goes for print culture in the Americas. But yeah, let me stop there. I see there's also a comment from Chad Harris, Shiel.
Thank you for that. And I just want to comment, as you were speaking there, I was thinking of the dangers of ahistorical thinking, the dangers of not actually understanding history and the development of these ideas. And Schwab seems to fall into that trap, maybe,
I agree.
or maybe traps us in that trap. Who knows? Maybe sets it up for us. But I was also thinking of something that I've noticed as someone who's kind of bridging different generations here. I'm grateful for and excited by these new technologies, but I also see an abundance of information alongside the erosion of wisdom, and that's a bit troubling. Okay, so Chad Harris, I am interested in your point relating to the dangers of our obsession with importing solutions to local problems, bringing in solutions to local problems, or modeling our society and economy too closely on other countries. We know economic orthodoxy, and hence people like Schwab and the WEF, promotes this approach because it takes internationalism and globalization as a default position. In looking for alternatives, what sort of theoretical or ideological perspectives should we explore? Also, what about the danger of isolationism, which is as much a part of our heritage as colonialism? Okay, some good questions there.
Oof, yeah, those are very sharp questions. Thank you, Chad. Okay, let me make a couple of remarks. I think the point that you make there, Chad, that isolationism is just as much a part of our colonial heritage is extremely important. I mean, it's always a temptation in this country and to think of us as an exceptional case. And in some regards, I think our history has very distinctive characteristics, but yeah, that comparative way of thinking about our condition, I think, is more helpful. Now, a further remark that I want to make is the great Ngugi wa Thiong'o came to the UFS, I think it was in 2012, 2013 for the Africa Day lecture. I don't know how many of you have ever experienced him in person or seen him on video or whatever, but he's a kind of trickster. He loves making jokes, but there's something of the old stereotype of an African sage to him. And Ngugi came to our campus and he was here for about a week, and everywhere he went, we gave seminars and talks, whatever. He said to people, I promise you, when I give my memorial lecture on Africa Day, I'll give you the answer to all your questions. Of course, we were all very curious, and then he delivered a fantastic lecture. At the end of that, he said, okay, I've made you this promise, so here's the answer to all your questions. And the answer is the world begins at home. The world begins at home. And so what he meant with that is that he said, the key thing for us, and I guess, Chad, this is perhaps more a method than even a theory, it's just a methodological remark, is that the key thing for former colonial countries who want to become truly free and sovereign is that we need to ask all the time, does whatever we import and does whatever we go and fetch elsewhere, does it actually enhance our condition towards freedom and shared dignity and mutual recognition? That for me is the key question, at least in South Africa. It's a kind of normative question. And so he also made much of something else that I fully espouse, which is a key marker of the successful advancement of who we are in the process of importing is, can you translate what you learned elsewhere into our context? Can you, and not only that, can you take in our local context, can you translate it into a broader context? And I think in that regard, I often joke with the conference I recently attended, most of the attendants came from the global north, and I joked to my colleagues, you know, they've got the resources that we can dream of, but we've got the thought matter, the questions, the challenges that they can only dream of. To simplify a bit, of course, but so I think that sort of emphasis on what will take us forward to take our place as equals in this world. That's the question that we should forever be asking. And if I can then, I mean, you can now if you take this line, the implications to the adoption of technology or economic policy, whatever, is enormous. But let me just make one remark here concerning the economy. So about 10, 15 years ago, I ran a monthly journal, and we worked very closely with a group of people called SAIN, South African New Economics Institution. And there were economists like Margaret Leacham, Norman Reynolds, Johan van Zyl. All of them died within 1 year in 2010. And they said that the opposite of poverty is not wealth, but it's self-reliance. And obviously this has interesting parallels also with Biko's thought. And so they said that if you want to think about eradicating colonial and racial patterns of in the economy, a very important aspect of that is how do you actually get capital to be invested in local communities, and that there our townships is there for the taking in our poor rural areas. And then they had ideas like, you know, ironically, the community of Orania adopted some of these ideas. What you do is you in your local area, you begin with a bit of outside capital, a small local bank and a local currency. And with a little bit of profit that you make, you get people to buy from your local bakery or your local shoemaker, whatever be the case. Because so much, for example, if you look at what happened last week, those economists pointed out how much capital on a daily basis flees those poor areas and goes into the urban areas. And so it's no surprise that last week, the shops that were attacked were predominantly in the urban and town areas. You know, from what I've seen at least, people, if you want, attacked more the formal economy than the informal economy. So I think those sort of ideas about developing local economies and bringing in capital through those mechanisms, that's the sort of thing that we should be thinking of, yeah, for what it's worth.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, I want to finish a little. Oh, there is a question, sorry. I just want to say we are, most of us are heading into a 3.5-hour meeting soon. So I might want to finish a couple minutes early. But Ed Terum says, thank you very much for this talk. It is really thought-provoking. Like you said, colonialism is a way of altering values of the colonized. My paraphrase. Don't you think that the current programming of 4R technologies, which is dominantly Eurocentric in terms of values, is another way for perpetuating colonialism, but this time around not in the classic form of colonialism, but a modern techno-colonialism? For example, there is a certain form of socioeconomic and political control of developing countries by initial colonial masters through technology. What do you think?
Fully agree, Ed. Fully agree. I mean, just want to, if we look at your comments, the fact of the matter is, what we should, I think, be looking at here. I guess many of you will know Joe Slovo's famous and much discussed term for apartheid as a special type of colonialism of a special type. Now, I've tried my best to have a term that I coined to have it adopted and taking off, but so far I remain unsuccessful, and I call it self-colonization of a special type. And what I refer to is, I mean, if you, Moletsi Mbeki last week in an interview on the riots that we saw, referred to what he called an inferiority complex of the ANC, who keeps on forever importing. He referred to Cuban engineers, but there's many other examples, forever importing skills and ideas from elsewhere and poorly adopting and applying them in the South African context. But I think the people that has a lot more to answer for is our university leadership. I mean, I find it absolutely sickening that post-94, we went into, I don't want to call it a new scramble for Africa, but it's a new kind of scramble for these world rankings. Because if you look at these world rankings, they, for example, if you do not publish in English, whatever you publish is not indexed in those rankings. So what is that if not new colonialism? And friends that I have in France complain about the same thing of all places. So the point for me, Ed, is to say that, of course, you're right that the new masters, and the new masters for me would be Google, and it would be Facebook and Amazon, and that fool who flew into space yesterday, the other fool who did it 9 days ago, I understand that so-called mission dumped 28 carbon dioxide tons onto the Earth. How the hell can we allow that to happen, you know? So there are those colonial masters, yes, but at the same time, we should take to book the people who are throwing away the dream that we all have in South Africa. Our future is being stolen by these university managers and by the nincompoops in government who sound all too bloody modern, but they are massacring our universities. They're destroying them and our intellectual capacity. And like Ingrid pointed out, nothing's been done for our languages. And those are the colonial masters, if you like, the colonial hand puppets, that I think we should first take to task. I mean, it's like I say, charity begins at home. So I'll stop there. I share my sincere sympathy with 3.5-hour meeting. I'm going to go swimming now.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for this very interesting talk. I hope you got some useful feedback from our audience. And I'm going to sign off soon, not before giving you a clap using my clap function, the primordial gesture of smacking our hands together when we see something we like and respect. Thank you, and thanks to the audience members for your insightful comments, and thanks to the UJ Library events team for hosting this, and the Faculty of Humanities for hosting it under there for our distinguished series banner. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye, Professor. Enjoy your swim.
Thank you very much. And I can just say also, I deeply appreciate this conversation. It was helpful for me. And Ashil, I can, the published version, it came out in a book chapter last year. Perhaps I can send it to you. If people are interested, they can get it from you, and you can share my email address by all means. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Yes, please. That's a plan. I'm typing my email address into the box just before I log out. So you will send me that paper, and if anybody wants it, they can email me at the address I've just typed in.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't send it to the right person.
No, that's right.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thank you, Professor. Everyone have a good afternoon.
Thank you. All right.
Bye-bye, everyone.